The beginning. We're starting the new Sicha. We're going to start from the very bottom, 193. Okay, we're going to start 193. Okay, here's the deal. As you know, we learn Sichas Mondays and Tuesdays. That's our custom. And we learned the Sichas from 60 years ago. We can't possibly cover them all. It's just not possible. We learn was es macht sich, whatever I find, whatever I like. So for the last 4 classes, we did the Sicha of Shabbos Mevorachim, Tamuz, and then some of the private talks that Rebbe had with the graduates, the counselors, and the Talmidim of Yeshivas Oyel Moshe with yesterday's class. Now we're doing a Beis Tamuz. We're not doing the whole Fabrengen, we're doing 3 Sichas, okay? The first Sicha is about the Friedrich Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh. The second Sicha, get ready, is about the building of 770. That's not only about the building of 770. It's the Rebbe complaining about Tzimtzum Kipshutei, how people's brains are so square that they should have been building buildings. The Rebbe was talking about the fact that for all these years he'd been going to halls for the big Fabrengens because there was no room in the building until someone decided finally that they should expand 770. So we're going to learn that Sicha. And the third Sicha we're going to learn is the Sicha to Neshei Chabad. So we're not learning the whole Fabrengen of Beis Tamuz, we're learning certain Sichas. Here we go. The last line on 193. Klei Gedushas Mervachomi Admor de Friedrich Rebbe Bala Simcha. Siper Pam once told the story. Gam came Beisvadus Tochel Yud Beis Tamuz. It was Taka also of a Bengen of Yud Beis Tamuz. Oidois regarding Yud Beis Tamuz Tofresh Nun Hey. Yud Beis Tamuz in the year Tofresh Nun Hey. Shechol b'yom chamishi ki b'shvi Shana Zu, that Yud Beis Tamuz that year was on Thursday. I told the story wrong. Just the other day I told the story. I said it was Tuesday. It was wrong. It was a Thursday. Here's the story. It's a story about Yud Beis Tamuz where the Friedrich Rebbe turned 15. You heard the story from me 15 times, maybe 50 times. Now the Rebbe is going to tell the story without the mistakes. Kivin shezeh hoya b'tkufas hakayis. Since this was in the summertime, Haya Aviv, his father, the Rebbe Rashab, Yachad in Bnei Beisei, together with the family, the wife, the children, Bnei Deshe, Dache, Kvishniklekan country, Dache, they went on vacation. And Lubavitch is a big metropolis. I was in Lubavitch. It's such a hole in the wall. It's such an excuse me of a town. And they went for our rest and recuperation to an even smaller loch. Samuch Lubavitch that was close to Lubavitch. Now you should know that it says in the Rishimis, Nesiches, and I'm going to explain this, that the Rebbe Rashab sent the Friedrich Rebbe to Cheder. Friedrich Rebbe to Cheder, all children. His first Melamed was, his dadki Melamed was Reb Kusil. His second Melamed who taught him Gemara was Reb Shimshon. And his third Melamed was Reb Nissen Skabla. After these 3 Melamedim, the Friedrich was probably 11. The Rebbe Rashab hired him a private tutor. He took him out of the Cheder. He hired him, who was the private tutor to learn with the Rebbe Rayatz? The great Chossid, the great Gonan Chossid, the Rashbatz, of Shmuel B'Tzalel Sheptil. The Rashbatz, I think he's buried in Lubavitch, has the distinction, the unbelievable distinction, of being the madrich of 2 of the 7 Chabad Rabbeim. When the Rebbe Rashab was a boy, the Rebbe Marash had hired him to tutor the Rebbe Rashab, and then 20 years later, the Rebbe Rashab hired his former tutor to tutor his son. So you can imagine who this man must have been, the Rashbatz, that he tutored 2 Rebbeim in the Baruch. I saw from Mendel Futterfass, or Sholem, that he says in a video, that Rashbatz had given an ish ruchni. The Rashbatz was a ruchni-istic person. And he explained how he knows. That somebody once asked the Friedrich Rebbe if there's an inyan to go to the kever of a chassid. When you go to a tzin of a Rebbe, is there an inyan to go to a kever of a chassid? So the Friedrich Rebbe said, Virashbatz yo. That was his answer. If it's a chassid like the Rashbatz, yeah. Because the Rashbatz was at an incredibly high level. But the neshama was there in the goof, you understand. It wasn't just rotting bones. So the Rashbatz was a gohim idiot. He was his private tutor. And they learned together everything. Nigla, Chassidus, he wouldn't learn Tanya with the Rashbatz. The Friedrich Rebbe's father the Rebbe Rashab had to teach him Tanya. But then there's a story that at one point, Mistam after Bar Mitzvah, the Rebbe Rashab told the Rebbe Shtenesada, told his wife, his Rebbetzin, ich hab machle gewesen, als mit sein Chinuch darf ich sich allein abgeben. The Rebbe Rashab at one point said, I decided that his Chinuch, I need to engage myself. And this was a whole new period in the life of the Rebbe Rashab, where besides for the time that he spent with his Madrich, with the Rashbat, the Rebbe Rashab spent time with him. He taught him different things. One of the things we know that he taught him was the Pirush Hamilas of Tefillah. The Rebbe Rashab taught the Frierdiker Rebbe the Pirush Hamilas of Tefillah. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said, my father did not want that it should be so obvious that he's spending so much time with me. That's the Frierdiker Rebbe. My father did not want that it should be so boilet, it should be so clear that he's spending a lot of time with me. So we would go away from Lubavitch for long periods. The excuse was it was vacation. But it wasn't vacation at all. The Rebbe Rashab wanted to spend time being Madrich, the Frierdiker Rebbe. So the way he did it was they went away with there's no pushing, nobody around. So dacha became very elongated. They left right after Shavuos, and they came back after Chayel. In other words, they didn't have 2 months of summer, they had virtually 4 months of summer. They left right after Shavuos, the beginning to the whole Tamuz, the whole of, more than half of Elul, and much more than half of Sivan. It was way more than 3 months that they were away. And this way the Rebbe Rashab was able to, as they say in Yiddish, abgeben sich, involve himself, dedicate himself to the chinuch of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the eyes, minatzad, other people were not able to be made, people Pasha didn't see. But the custom was every Monday they came to Lubavitch. Let's keep reading. The custom was shebechol yom sheni b'shavua, every Monday, every Monday the Rebbe Rashab would go to Lubavitch, lekabel anoshim, to greet people who came to Lubavitch for Yechidas. The last day says kolo and yonim sherotza, last day Lubavitch to do all the things that he needed to do on Lubavitch, and of course those included a number of things. Number one, he would answer mail. And number two, on lacheda hu ha'ikeh, he would affect that eingehen to the mammon. The Rebbe Rashab's custom was that every Monday, even when he lived in Lubavitch, he would go into his mother, and he would boil up a chaynik of tea, and he would serve her. This was his kibbutz avei. Once a week, he went into his mother. The Rebbetzin Ifke was a smart lady. She was a Rebbetzin, so she would invite 2 or 3 Elter Chassidim to come and be at the table. So these Monday get-togethers between father and mother, son and mother, became, it was like miniature private Fabrengen. They lasted a half an hour, an hour. When the Rebbe was away from Lubavitch, he would come back on Monday just to go into his mother, he would boil up the chaynik, a samavar, and then he would pour her a glass of tea, and they would sit, and he would leave. So even when he was out of Lubavitch, Monday he came to Lubavitch to answer mail, to greet people in Yechidus, and to go into his mother. The same was the Seder then, Gam b'yem sheni b'shvua, on that Monday, shalifnei yed beis Tamuz, shechol b'yem chamish. The Monday before that Yud Beis Tamuz. So if Yud Beis Tamuz was on Thursday, then Tes Tamuz was on Monday. But Yom Revi Wednesday, the day before Yud Aleph Tamuz. Kara kfei kedushas admur nishmas eiden es b'nei kfei kedushas meid v'chami admur bal simcha. The Rebbe Rashab called the Frierdiker Rebbe, who was going to be 15. And he told him the following: tomorrow early you should tavel in the river. And by the way, he also told him you should daven early. And then they're going to go to Lubavitch. Mibli leimalei ta'amadover. The Rebbe Rashab didn't tell the Frierdiker Rebbe the reason for this trip. The Frierdiker Rebbe got up very, very early. Tov al Benad, he tabled in the river. His spalo, and they davened. Then they traveled to Lubavitch. Nesia she'arka kamizman. The trip took more than 5 minutes. It was a trip, let's say an hour, or 2. Kach, in such a way, 8 or 9 in the morning, they were already left. You have to understand, in that time of year, you can daven shachar probably 5 o'clock, 5:30. So the Rebbe Yas got up very early. It's a getavel, you davened, and then they went to Lubavitch. They arrived at 8 or 9 in the morning. Before they came into the city, Omar, Kvei Kedushas made V'chomei Admor La'aviv. The Frierdiker Rebbe said to his father, the Rebbe Rashab, Shekiven Sheboim Lelubavitch Bepiseim. Bepiseim, they're coming to Lubavitch by surprise. In other words, it's not a scheduled visit. They came every Monday. This was now Thursday. Page 194, the 5th paragraph. Alula Hasapta, it's possible that the Baba, the grandmother, Ime, Shalkvei Kedush Admonition of the Rebbe Rashab, Lihi Bohel, that she should be afraid. Umenaroy, and it would be appropriate to be Lohidia Lotchila, if they would tell her in advance, Sheboyim Shalei B'Yem HaMiyuad, they're coming not on the regular days, so that she shouldn't be afraid. And so the Rebbe Rashab told the Frierdiker Rebbe, your grandmother already knows. She knows, she's not going to become afraid. When they came to Lubavitch, the first place they went was to visit the Rebbe Rashab's mother. The Frierdiker Rebbe remained outside, and the Rebbe went in alone to his mother, and apparently he told his mother what was going to happen. This is one of the most dramatic moments in the Frierdiker Rebbe's life. But the Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't given any warning. It was all surprise. The Rebbe Rashab planned this trip. His mother knew about this plan. So to the Rebbe Rashab, it was obviously not a surprise. To the Rebbetzin Rivka, the Rebbe Rashab's mother, she knew what was going to be. But the Frierdiker Rebbe had no clue what was about to happen. Ubetzefsam, when the Rebbe Rashab came out from his mother, Lifsa Harabonis says Benok, Kvei Kedushas Monish Masayedin, the Rebbetzin Rivka accompanied the Rebbe Rashab Beponim Eiris Bebrachis Levavius, with a radiant face and very heartfelt brachas. The Rebbetzin Rivka knew what was happening. The Frierdiker Rebbe didn't know. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is watching people behave extraordinarily sincere and earnest and emotional, and he has no idea why, because he doesn't know what's about to happen. But the Rebbetzin knows, and the Rebbe knows. Ukvei Kedushas Admor Nishmasei Eid Nomal Lebnei. The Rebbe Rashab said to the Frierdiker Rebbe, Ba'ala Simcha she'achshav yisa imel el. Now they're going to go together to the oil. B'boyim l'oil. When they came to the oil, Posach Kvei Kedushas Admor Nishmasei Eid is Delis oil. You open up the door to the oil. Now, if you could visualize the oil in Queens, there's a tiny little room, a hallway that has a roof above it. That room at the end of the hall has a little on Kedish with a Sefer Torah. I mean, they daven there. If people, there's a shul. I mean, you can't fit more than a minyan b'tzumtzum into that tiny little space. In Lubavitch, that shul probably was a larger room. It wasn't a little hallway. Probably a larger room. So there was a shul adjacent to the oil. Obviously, the oil, the roof is open. But the other Rabbeim, you should know, the oils were closed. The Alter Rebbe's oil is closed. The Middle Rebbe's oil is closed. The Rebbe Rashab's oil, I forgot if it's open or closed, but it's a new oil. In Lubavitch, the oil is also with a roof. When our Rebbe made the oil, the Frierdiker Rebbe, he made it open. And he did it for Koyanim. I mean, halachically, a Koyan is allowed to go into the Tzion of a Tzaddik because the Tzaddik's not Metameh. But the Rebbe wanted to do everything also api nigla. That's why he made the wall around the oil 10 tefachim. The wall around our oil is very tall. It's this high. Most of the oilim, they don't have such a wall unless they redid it. And the Rebbe made a wall of 10 tefachim so that a kohen should be able to walk over. Again, a kohen can go into an oil of a Rebbe even if there's a roof because the tzaddik is not metameh. But the Rebbe wanted to make, our Rebbe wanted to make everything up in nigle, so the oil is open and there's a wall 10 tefachim so that the kohen could approach until the wall. There wouldn't be a wall of 10 tefachim. From a nigla standpoint, the kohen would have to stand 4 amis, 4 cubits. There's no dalat amis in the whole room over there for a kohen to stand. So the door next door is a shul. Obviously, a shul has a roof. Our oil has no roof; it's open. Special for the Rebbe to stand under the snow and the sleet and the rain for many, many years until someone figured out that they could build the Rebbe a little room with a roof. Which by the Rebbe opened when the Rebbe went to the oil, he would open up the roof. So he was standing under Likipas Hashamayim, so he can get wet and hot and cold. All the wonderful brachas that the Rebbe loves that come in Hashamayim as he's standing and being made a racham and happen for Kol Klal Yisrael. But there was a shul and an oil. So he opened the door to the oil. The Pasach Gam es ha'oren HaKedesh. The Beis HaMedrash HaSamach. He went into the shul and opened the Oren Kodesh. In other words, this whole event was very dramatic. He opened the Oren Kodesh. He opened the door to the oil, and then he turns to the Frierdiker Rebbe, who has no idea what's about to happen. Today was his birthday. This is Thursday. Rabbi Tamuz, Tov, and Hey was the Frierdiker Rebbe's 15th birthday. Okay, I don't know if you remember your 15th birthday. I don't know exactly what I remember of my 15th birthday, but we were children. I mean, we're still children. When we were 15, we were certainly children. And he told them like this: Het werten. Hineni mevi hayoyim es beni la'akeda. I am bringing my son, the Frierdiker Rebbe, to an akeda. Know what akeda means? Tying him up. Akeda means to tie hands and feet. You tie the hands and feet that the animal shouldn't shake and the shechita would become possible. So akeda is not the shechita, akeda is the binding. Be'inyan ha'akeda, when there is an event of an akeda, yesh eiked v'nei akad. There is a binder and a bindee. The Rebbe Rashab is binding, the Rebbe Rayatz is being bound. Avram Avinu olav hashalom, akad es Yitzchak b'nei. Avram Avinu olav hashalom tied his son Yitzchak, kadei shelihi bei psul chas v'shalom, that the shechita should not have a psul. And the meaning of this binding, we call it Akedas Yitzchak. We don't call it Ha'alas Yitzchak, we call it Akedas Yitzchak. L'mashakoso b'medrash, like it says in the Medrash, that B'shah shebikesh Avram laked ben Yitzchak b'nei, when Avram Avinu tied his son Yitzchak, Amalei, Yitzchak said to Avram, Abba, Bocharani, I'm young, and I'm strong, V'chei shishani shemei is da'azei gufi, that maybe just the shechita, my body will shake. V'shemet tipasal shechita. Yitzchak says to his father, "You're going to shecht me. Maybe I'm going to move, and the shechita will become possible." Kafteni yafa yafa. Imagine Yitzchak says to Abraham, "Tie me up so well that I shouldn't be able to move and make my own shechita possible." So the Rebbe Rashab continues. I also desire that the binding should be good. So this is a father taking a 15-year-old son who's a Rebbe, a Neshama clothes to be, a Rebbe, a Neshama clothes he was from birth, but a Rebbe, a Nasiv Yisrael to be, says, I want to tie you up well. And it continues. When the Frierdiker Rebbe told the story, he said, how you his father had tears running down his face, and at one point the Paratz Bechi actually burst into tears. This was a very emotional event for the Rebbe Rashab. The Frierdiker Rebbe, he had no idea what was about to happen. He had no idea. The father is taking the son. The father knows why they're going. The son doesn't know why they're going. But when the father cries, the son cries. Top of 195. After this, Lomad Kfei Kedushas Admonish Masayeden, the Rebbe Rashab learned, together with the Frierdiker Rebbe, Bifnei Aron HaKedesh Pasuach, in front of the open Aron Kedesh, Chatzi Peirik Me'ageres HaKedesh, Di B'Ramaschel Chogra Be'ez Masneha. There is no Ageres HaKedesh that says Chogra Be'ez Masneha. The first Ageres HaKedesh in Tanya starts with the words Peschim B'Brocha. But it's a maimer Chogra Be'ez Masneha, and I'll tell you briefly what it's about. Chogra Be'ez Masneha means you tie the masneim, the thighs, the girdle, like this, yeah? Api Kabbalah, it's the nihi, the netzach heden you say. This is the Chabad, this is the Chagas until here, until where the elbows are, where you have the diaphragm, and from below here, that's why you're supposed to wear a gartel here, not here. The gartel is supposed to be above the navel. Right here, with the elbows, that's where they tie the gartel. So the baby, if you look at pictures, the Rebbe's gartel was much higher. Where most people keep the gartel is where the elbows are, and below this is the nihi. Chogra Be'ez Masneha, you have to bind the nihi. And the Alter Rebbe explains in Kabbalah terms, what does it mean to put Chogra Be'ez Masneha, the pasuk Meshes Chaya, right? That she ties with ois, with strength, her thighs. It goes on the nihi. The lowest third of the person is the netzach heden yesed. Netzach heden yesed is the seat of action, right? The The emotions that motivate action are netzach. Netzach means to fight. Hoid means to be stubborn. Yisoid means to connect. Those are the emotions connected to action. And in halacha, in Torah, that's dinim, Shulchan Aruch. The part of Shulchan Aruch which is connected to dinihi is halacha l'maisa. So the Alter Rebbe wrote a letter about learning Gemara, Chalukas Hashas. But he's talking about learning Gemara nicht als lomdis, but als halacha l'maisa. You understand? That's why that Igeres HaKedesh is about Chagra Be'ez Masneha. Gemara is scholarship. This is Chabad. And if there's machlekes, it's Chagas. Halacha l'maisa is Nihi. So the Rebbe was talking about learning Gemara, but to learn Gemara on a level which is halachic, practical. So the idea of Chagra Be'ez Masneha means the lowest part of the person, the least sophisticated part of the person, has to be tied up, because that's where the action is. That's where you do Maisa B'Poyel. And of course the most important thing is Maisa B'Poyel. So it's a pasuk in Mishlei, it's a pasuk in Eishes Chayil, that you have to tie up the Misnayim. Now we always learn that you put on a gartel to separate. You understand? Why do you put on a gartel? To separate from this part of the body from the lower part of the body. But here you're saying a different word. You're not putting on a gartel to separate. In halacha it's called Shalai Tia Liba Yeroya. This is called the lave, the heart, and what's the lower part of it is called the erved. They're not allowed to be able to see each other. You can't make a bracha. So you put on a gartel to separate the higher part from the lower part. Here he's giving a different taich. You're not putting on a gartel to separate what's above the diaphragm. What below the diaphragm, you're putting on a gartel to bind the lowest part of the body. You understand? Not to separate, but to then he needs a binding, because this is where action is. Maise, netzach, and when it comes to doing mitzvahs practically, which in Lamdisha terms it means to study halakha. You understand? And this is the first letter in the Tanya. It's Igeres HaKedesh. It's Poischem B'Bracha. The that Igeres HaKedesh is Chagra Be'ez Masneha, that you have to tie up the Nihi. So the Rebbe Rashab learned it with the Frierdiker Rebbe. In other words, it's a binding. It's a gartel. A gartel is a binding. And like I said a minute before, sometimes you put on a gartel to separate, and sometimes you put on a gartel to bind. So the Rebbe Rashab is talking to the Frierdiker Rebbe in front of an open Aron Kodesh, an open door to the Ohel, and he's calling it an Akedah, he's calling it a tying up. And he learns with him that piece of Tanya that talks about binding well. You have to good subindin, you have to tie it up well. That, in other words, we shouldn't just be Jews in our head, we shouldn't just be Jews in our heart, we shouldn't just be Jews in our senses, we should be Jews where it's the most difficult and the most important, in the practical dimension. And that's the concept of this gartel that the Rebbe Rashab is preparing for the Frierdiker Rebbe. And after he learns this, he gets a half of this, he gets HaKedesh, Paul Nel B'nei. Now the Rebbe Rashab finally tells his son, the Frierdiker Rebbe, what's about to happen. Omi says the following: Bifneihem shall avoisai hakdesh. In the presence of my holy fathers, the Hainu Ha'oil, meaning the oil, Shabbai Muntmunim at Tzemach Tzedek, Vad Marash, where it's hidden away, the Guf Kodesh of the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Guf Kodesh of the Rebbe Marash, Hineni Keiros Bris Imcha, I'm making with you a covenant, and he connects it to binding, to an Akedah, to Chagra Be'ez Masneha. Mei Hayoim, the Frierdiker is 15. From today, Hineni Meise Lecha Es Aveda Baskanas HaKlal. I am giving you all my work as a public servant. The Rebbe Rashab was a Rebbe. Every Rebbe is responsible for the whole world, certainly for all the Yidden of Russia. And the Rebbe says to Frierdiker Rebbe, I'm giving you this job. Now, why did the Rebbe Rashab give Frierdiker Rebbe? He didn't want to do it himself. The Rebbe Rashab gave the Frierdiker Rebbe his job because this is the Frierdiker Rebbe's inyan. And in my small little mind, the way I understand it is, the Rebbe Rashab knew what would happen to the Frierdiker Rebbe as a Rebbe. And you need 25 years to be the Rebbe that the Frierdiker Rebbe was, with all the unbelievable variety of different hardships. You need 25 years of chinuch. So at 15, he becomes a Rebbe. At 40, at 15, his father says, I'm giving you all my public work. You're going to do it under my tutelage, under my counsel, under my guidance. And this was the Rebbe's life. The Frierdiker Rebbe served the Jewish people 55 years. Until 15 he was a person, and after 15 he was a servant of the Jewish people. Be'inyonim gashmim u'be'inyonim ruchnim, both in material things and in spiritual things. V'hoisif, and then he added, V'omar, and he said, Oides ha'maimer chogra be'ez masneha, about this maimer, chogra be'ez masneha, like I said before, it starts with the words Peschim bebracha. It's about a gartel, about tying up the Nehi, and like I told you before, the Alter Rebbe speaks about learning halacha l'maisa, even though he's talking about Gemara, Chalukas Hashas, but apparently the Alter Rebbe wanted that Hasidim should learn Gemara, aliba de hilchasa, to know the halachas, and he told them the following: Reishes ha'aveda mimatchilam mimasnayim. Bichlal work and work as a public servant starts here, in the thighs, in the lowest part of the body. You know why? That's the place of Kabbalah Seil. The mind and the heart are not Kabbalah Selniks. They're critical, they're analytical, they're studying, they're thinking. Yeah, Kabbalah Seil begins in the Nehi. Masnayim tzrichim chagur, and the thighs, the Nehi, which is where public service begins, because it's a place of Mesiras Nefesh, it's a place of Kabbalah Seil, needs to be bound, eingebunden, tied up. Umaya chagura, what is the gartel that you tie up the Nehi? Oiz. Umahu oiz, Mesiras Nefesh. What's oiz? Mesiras Nefesh. And then the Rebbe Rashab says, Umahu Mesiras Nefesh. What's Mesiras Nefesh? Kach v'lo yacheret. And then it says in Yiddish, Azoi unitandish. This way and no other way. This is one of the most dramatic stories in the history of Lubavitch. Chabad.
This way and no other way, I missed it.
This, dafka like this and no other way. When you're doing public service, there's no negotiations. There's no compromises. There's no 50%, 60%, 70%. This way and no other. You don't budge. You don't budge from your principle in iota. So the Rebbe says, Askana Sibura starts with Nihi, because that's the seat of Mesiras Nefesh and Kabbalah Seil. You have to bind, you have to give a koyach to the Nihi. And what's that koyach? What's the gartel? It's the gartel of Mesiras Nefesh. So and no different. Now I want to interrupt. I want to tell you a different story. Which is not, it didn't happen at the same time, but in my view it's very connected to this story. And at least in part it explains why the Rebbe Rashab went to his mother. She was in on it. The Rebbe Tzadivka was in on this whole Inyan. She was a grandmother, and her son came to her and said, listen, I'm taking my 15-year-old boychikol and I'm giving him away to the Jewish people. His life as a private person is going to be over. And that's exactly how it was. The Rebbe once said that Chassidim came to the Rebbe Rashab and they said, you're playing with your son's life. He sent him on very dangerous missions again and again and again. And they told the Rebbe Rashab, you can't do this. This is your son. It was a Ben Yochid. And the Rebbe says, no. This is the only way. And the Lashon is Muftachani Azer Vet Maidach Yamam Zayin. I know for sure that he's going to live long. He lived 70. The Rebbe said once that the last 17 years of his life was Kulei Apines. Muftachani. But the Rebbe Rashab sent the Frierdiker Rebbe on missions that were mamish, virtual suicide missions. And the Frierdiker Rebbe went, and he did them, and he came back to Lubavitch like nothing happened. So I want to tell you a different story. This is in the Rebbe's Rishimis, Rebbe's personal journal, which was disclosed after Gimel Tamuz, and it has a very powerful story. The story is the following. The Alter Rebbe had 3 sons. The Mittel Rebbe, at a certain point, I don't know what age, the Alter Rebbe called in the Mittel Rebbe and he gave him a gartel. And it probably was woven by one of the Rebbetzins, a silk gartel. He had 3 sons. The gartel that he gave the Mittel Rebbe, he didn't give his other children. Years later, he called in the Tzemach Tzedek, his grandson, and he gave him a gartel as well. And again, he didn't give it to any other of his grandchildren. Then, years later, the Tzemach Tzedek called the Rebbe Maharash, his youngest of 7. And in the presence of his Malamed, there was a Malamed who taught in the Beis Harav. There was a private cheder just for the children of the Rebbe. Tzemach Tzedek had many, many children and grandchildren. And there was a Malamed, I think his name was in a Pesach, but I don't remember and I didn't look, so I shouldn't even try and guess. And in the presence of this Malamed, he gave the Rebbe Maharash a gartel. So this Malamed says to the Tzemach Tzedek, I taught all of your sons, or I taught many of your sons. I don't remember you giving them a gartel like you're giving him. The Rebbe Nash was the youngest. So the Tzemach Tzedek said, Bazeh Alosh, Ba uns is nitokin kashes, Af uns is nitokin kashes, Die was verstehen, die was verstehen nicht, verstehen. By us there are no questions, on us there are no questions. Those who understand, understand. Those who don't understand, don't understand. End of story. Fast forward 20 years or 25 years. This same Malamed was now the Malamed of the Rebbe Rashab, of the Tzemach Tzedek, of the Rebbe Rash's son. And he calls the Malamed. And in the presence of the same Malamed, he gives the Rebbe Rashab a garden. So the Malamed was probably a PK. It doesn't say what the Malamed was thinking, but I would imagine the Malamed had verstanden. He says to the Rebbe Marash, you have an older son? And I taught him also, how come you didn't give him a gartel? So the Rebbe Marash repeated verbatim what his father had said a whole generation before. Ba uns is nitokin kashes, af uns is nitokin kashes, divas verstehen, verstehen, divas verstehen nicht. By us there are no questions, on us there are no questions. Those who understand, understand, those who don't understand. So there's a tradition from generation to generation that the Rebbe would give a gartel to the son or grandson that was Mamala Mekayim, none of the others. And because of this Malamed, we sort of have this idea flushed out. When the Friedrich Rebbe was 11, the Rebbe Rashab said to his mother, the Rebbe Tzendivke, Ich tracht geben nem a gartel. Said to his mother, the same Rebbetzin that they went in to visit, I'm thinking to give him a gartel. So the Rebbetzin said to him, Wie der Tate hat dir gegeben, the way your father gave you. And the Rebbe Rashab said, Wie der Tate hat mir gegeben, like my father gave me. So the Rebbe Tzendivke said, I want to make it myself. She bought the silk and she weaved it. I mean, I don't understand how you make a gartel. She made it, she weaved it herself. Yeah. It took her some time. She made the gartel herself. When the gartel was complete, the Frierdiker was in his 12th year, he was 11. She called the Rebbe Rayatz and she gave him the gartel. She didn't say a word. So he said to her, what's this? She said, if you want to know what this is, you have to go and ask your father. So the Frierdiker Rebbe ran to his father, holding the gartel in his hand. And if I remember it correctly, I haven't learned the Rebbe's Hashimis literally in 25 years or 20 years since they were published. But that's how I remember it. My memory used to work. He ran to his father. The Rebbe Rashab had a seder. That he would always call the Frierdiker Rebbe by his full name. He always called him Yosef Yitzchak. He always called him by both names, Yosef Yitzchak. You see it in the Sichas, Yosef Yitzchak. But there were occasions when B'dicha Daite, when the Rebbe Rashab was in a very good mood, that he would use nicknames for the Frierdiker Rebbe. He would call him Rabbi Yasher, Rabbi Yezel, Rabbi Yossel. He had a number of nicknames. And usually the Rebbe Rashab would identify him Yosef Yitzchak. But sometimes he would use a nickname. On that occasion, when the Rebbe came to his father holding this gartel, his father he knocked on the door, his father opened the door, Rabbi Yezel, with a very warm and embracing greeting. What do you want? And the Rebbe raised the gartel. The Frierdiker Rebbe raised the gartel. He just showed him. As soon as the Rebbe saw the gartel, his face changed completely. He became unbelievably serious, and he led him into his room, and he closed the door. The rest of the story is not in the Rishimas. What he told them behind closed doors. Now I would gamble, that the Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe what happened behind closed doors, but the Rebbe didn't write it down. And the end of the story is, and this story, they printed the book early years, they didn't want to print the story as reliable because they can't find it in documentation. The professors haben gesagt, am gesagt das Balpeh ist nicht emes, as geschrieben ist emes. This stupid world of ours. So in the footnote, there's a book early years, it's a really special book. They don't have this story. It's a very important story. That before the Rebbe's chuppah, before our Rebbe's chuppah, they went into the Cheder HaYichud. You have to make a chones, you have to put on a kittel and so on. The Frierdiker Rebbe asked everybody to leave. The only people who he let stay was his father-in-law. The Frierdiker Rebbe's Shver and Shviger, Rebbe's Nechamedina's parents were our Rebbe's Chassanim. And of course the Frierdiker Rebbe's mother was there. And Rebbe L'chaim. Rebbe L'chaim Altos was the witness. He told the story. He said, "Du kannst bleiben. You can stay." The door closed. The Frierdiker Rebbe took a gartel. And he tied the Rebbe with the gattel before his chuppah. And he said, the emes is, I need to make a brocha. Oizer Yisrael begvura. Oizer Yisrael begvura is the same thing as chagra ba'oiz masneha. He said, but I already made the bracha in the morning, and I'm assuming he meant that I had this in mind. And he told the Rebbe, mit dem bin dich zu mir und mich zu dir b'zeu b'bo. This was the Rebbe's Akedah. You understand? He said to the Rebbe, I am tying you to me and me to you in this world and in the next world with this God. See, here you have the rest of the story. Understand? When the Frierdiker Rebbe was 11, I'm interpreting, I'm inferring. Yeah. Frierdiker Rebbe was 11. The Rebbetzin made him a gattel based on the instructions of the Rebbe, the son, and the Rebbe was given the gattel. On his 15th birthday, the Rebbe Rashab says, now is Akedah. I'm binding you. When our Rebbe got married, the Rebbe Zogazunzan married the Rebbe Chaya Mushka, the Frierdiker Rebbe gave him the gattel. He didn't get the gattel before Bar Mitzvah because he wasn't a son, he was a son-in-law. Again, this is all inference. You can't know for sure. But when you read the story in the Rishim, it's so clear that this is where it's going towards. And he tied him physically with the gattel. Let's keep reading. Page 195, the fourth paragraph on the top, the fifth paragraph. Umayaz, and from that point, his chilo, haskonos, va'aveda, shaltvei, kedushas, mara v'chami, admor, ba'ala simcha, began the public service and work of the Frierdiker Rebbe, tachas hanholas oviv, under the tutelage of his father. Behad gishay, and he emphasized that hein binyanim gashmi, v'hein binyanim ruchni, but both when it comes to material things and spiritual things, the Frierdiker Rebbe is, so to speak, responsible for the Askonos Siburis of the Rebbe Rashab. And there's a new sefer that came out. It's not a new sefer. It's based on Yoshan Malei Chodesh. They're reprinting now the Morim of the Rebbe Rashab with Maramakemis and Horace. It's a whole job. So the latest krach that came out, it's this big, is Safresh Samachay, 1905. So I was reading the Maimonim. I didn't read you can't read Maimonim in bed, but the stories in the back you could read. In 1905, 1905 was a hard year. There was a revolution in Russia. And there was the Russo-Chinese War, the Japanese War. And there were a lot of Yiddish tzaras, pogromen. And you read how all of these concerns were the concerns of the Rebbe Rashab. He was the Rebbe the Nasi. And all of the work was done side by side, the Rebbe the father with the Rebbe the son. Okay? Ba'alas tachas hanholas aviv, under the guidance of his father, bahadgish, by emphasizing hein binyanim gashmin, vehein binyanim ruchni, both when it comes to physical things and when it comes to spiritual things. Now I'm going back to the story now. Okay, after this introduction, Shazal Inyan Shal Akedah, the Rebbe Rashab told the Frierdiker Rebbe, I'm taking you to an Akedah. It doesn't necessarily mean that he had to tie his hands and his feet, or even physically tie his waist. It was a spiritual, it was a metaphysical Akedah. Shalachein tzorech alzeh krisus bris. You need to have for this a covenant. Shemamida es hadover, that fixes the matter. B'maimed u'mazav, in a condition, shu heipach the seichel, it's the opposite seichel. Tam vadas, above reason. And this is the story of how the Frierdiker Rebbe at 15 became a public servant. And I want you to know that one of the things that our Rebbe did, 1 minute, 60 seconds, but with Gewaldike Simaslev, the Rebbe, our Rebbe, was always concerned to give the Frierdiker Rebbe nachas ruach. Frierdiker Rebbe, Bechlal, a Rebbe needs nachas ruach. A Rebbe is a basket of tzaddiks. Everybody comes, dumps their tzaddiks. The good news you forget to give. And the Rebbe wanted very much to give the Frierdiker Rebbe Besur Sips. In Tafshin Zayin, Tafshin Hey, 1945, it was called the Yovel HaMeshulish. It was the triple Yovel, Yud Beis Tammuz, that year. It was Chai Shana. It was 18 years since the Chag HaGeula of Yud Beis Tammuz. It was a Yovel Shanim. It was 50 years since the story of the Krisus Bris. And it was 65 years since the Frierdiker Rebbe's birth. So our Rebbe wrote letters to Chassidim all over the world, telling them, you must send the Rebbe the Shver a Mazel Tov for the Yovel HaMeshulish. Yud Beis Tammuz Tavshin Hey. It was 65 years since the Rebbe's birth, 50 years since the beginning of the Askonas Tziburis, and Chai Shana 18 years since the Chagol Yud Beis Tammuz. And the Rebbe wrote to all the Chassidim, tell the Frierdiker Rebbe Mazel Tov, but don't tell him that I told you. If the Frierdiker Rebbe finds out that the Rebbe initiated the ganze Meise, it defeats the whole purpose. Okay, I'll see you, Mr. Shem. I'll see you, Mr. on Thursday.